entriamo proprio nel vivo del tema che David Nicol ci presenta, cioè come possiamo utilizzare il feedback, ma soprattutto cosa possono fare gli studenti del feedback, non solo noi docenti che tipo di feedback possiamo dare, ma qual è poi l'uso veramente che si può fare del feedback, che gli studenti possono fare del feedback.
Una cosa che ho apprezzato molto di David Nicol, e lo dico agli studenti qui, è che David ci ha proposto di feedback, nel senso che, come dice il suo titolo, quello di porre nelle mani degli studenti il feedback, quindi le sue ricerche dimostrano che il feedback più significativo e più efficace è quello che gli studenti producono per gli altri studenti, quindi è una prospettiva molto interessante proprio perché appunto pone lo studente al centro della valutazione, è lo studente che agisce con stile valutativo e attraverso il giudizio per dare il feedback al pari, quindi è una bella, insomma, rivoluzione copernicana, direbbe qualcuno, no? Perché la valutazione diventa qualcosa propria dello studente. Quindi lasciamo adesso la parola a David.
Okay, I seem to have the after lunch slot. The luckiest one. Anyway, I'm going to speak slowly for you to help you. And also I think that while I'm doing my talk, I don't mind if you ask me a question while I'm doing the talk. And going further, I don't mind if the international people want to ask me a question as well, because it's after lunch for me as well, I may not be as clear as I thought it would be. So, my talk is on, it's not, well, I'll start. My title is Teacher Evaluation to Learner Evaluation. That gives some of it away, and putting feedback processes back into the hands of students, and that gives the other part of it away. There's been a lot of talk about assessment and feedback, but I want to clarify my position before we move on. So the first 3 slides are just a kind of position statement. I'm not interested in how teachers evaluate students' work and make judgments about it to give marks or voti. What I'm interested in is how students learn to evaluate and make judgments about their own work and the work of other people, and the interaction between these 2 processes, which proves to be very interesting. My conception of feedback from this perspective, I'm not interested very much in the external feedback information that teachers or others provide to students in order to help them to learn or to improve their academic work. For this talk, I'm not really interested in that because I don't really think that that's important. What I'm actually interested in, and my conception of feedback, is that feedback is internal information that students generate themselves as they produce work and as they utilize, and when they utilize information provided by others. So my interest is in what I'm now calling generative feedback. The feedback that the students generate themselves that results in learning. And if we can improve generative feedback, we can improve learning, regardless of what the teacher does. So this changes the kinds of questions we might ask. I'm not interested in how we can improve the quality of teacher-provided feedback and its use by students, which is a slight twist on what Anna said about what I'm going to talk about. I don't think the focus should be on trying to make students better use teachers' feedback. There are hundreds and hundreds of papers on this, and the issue has still not been established. There are good results and there are bad results, but that's really not my concern. What I'm interested in, how do we improve students' inner feedback processes so that they're better able to monitor, evaluate, and regulate their own learning independently of teachers? Now, one reason why this focus is important is that there's only one teacher, usually, and as someone pointed out earlier, there are hundreds of students, so we need to find a way of getting students to generate their own feedback without the teacher, you know, or, well, that's not totally true. We need the teacher. The teacher's role is not to talk. The teacher's role is to design learning environments where feedback gets generated. That's the teacher's role. The teacher's role is a designer, principally. Okay, what I'm going to talk is I'm going to just say a little bit more about that and give the theoretical context and talk about what the purpose of assessment and feedback should be and conceptions behind that. Then I'm going to present some research on peer review. I've been researching peer review, and it's very interesting from a generative feedback process, because while students generate feedback for other students, they're writing some feedback for them, they actually generate feedback for themselves. And that's the power of peer review. And this is why it makes it different from anything else that's been done. But the conditions for its effectiveness are very important. I'm going to give one practical example which has quotes from students, so you can see what the students say, and maybe some of you will relate to those ideas, having maybe done peer review yourself. Then I'll just say something about, nothing is perfect, about the potential limitations of peer review and how they might actually be overcome to make peer review even more powerful. And I'll end, I probably won't have a lot of time to say this, I've written a chapter somewhere on guiding principles for peer review, where I've outlined everything. So feel free to stop me and ask me any questions. That applies to anyone in the room, including Valentina, Anna, and the others. Okay, I see it's easy to say that the purpose of assessment and feedback is that students should learn. But it's a bit of a vague statement. What do we really mean by learning? Have you ever Googled the definition, what is learning, into the search engine? You get a lot of interesting circular results. So I had a project in 2005, 2007. It involved implementing new assessment and feedback practices in large first-year classes. And I thought to myself then, what should the students be able to do when they leave university? They should be able to set their own goals and evaluate their own performance against those goals. That's what they should be able to do. Now, what do I need to do in the first year to start that process off? And I developed a set of principles that would help do that. However, what I'm talking about today, I think, is even more powerful than that. Since I did that work, there's been a lot of focus on the concept of evaluative judgment. And I think evaluative judgment underpins self-regulation, that being able to make judgments about things is something that students should be able to do. And there's a lot been written about evaluative judgment. These are just some ideas, which I'll cover briefly. John Cowan wrote a paper and said, evaluative judgment had been under-recognized in higher education. It actually underpins all kinds of decision-making and reflective practice. Bensley and Halpern said, evaluation is the critical component in critical thinking, that in devising an important research question, or seeing whether the evidence supports the argument, or determining whether this mathematical solution is more elegant than this one, or deciding whether this is a good diagnosis, they're all involves evaluation, and we should be focusing on this as a key skill for students. Sadler argued that we should stop talking about feedback and even get rid of the word and try and consider how we would develop students' expertise. And he said, to develop expertise, we need to develop students' appraisal skills, their ability to make judgments. I wrote a paper in 2010 for the Quality Assurance Agency in Scotland, and they were very interested there in what was called graduate attributes, which had infected us from Australia. And here, it's beginning to happen here in Italy, I've noticed. They call it soft skills. And what we need to do is to develop all these soft skills. I argued in this paper, which no one, I must say, paid any attention to, okay, someone did. And I argued in this paper that actually any key skill like that is underpinned by evaluation. You can't develop communication skills unless you can make a judgment about what good communication is, the communication you make and the communications you receive. You can't develop ethical thinking unless you can make ethical judgments and ethical evaluations. So underpinned all the attributes. So why waste your time trying to do them all separately? Why not just work on the core and develop that within different contexts? Lamming made a very interesting comment about evaluative judgment, which related to our philosopher, who's not here anymore, unfortunately, this morning, that there is no such thing as an absolute evaluation. An evaluation is always a comparative process. It's about making a comparison of one thing with another. When a teacher evaluates your work, even if there is only one piece of work, the comparator is the idea they have in their heads about what good work is, and that's what they make the judgment against. Key argued that making judgments is a knowledge-building process, that when you make a judgment about something, you actually develop your knowledge as well as develop the skill. And I suppose you could say in Bloom's taxonomy, evaluation is at the top. So if you do evaluation, you're going to get the knowledge anyway, if you can make judgments. So that's the idea of evaluation. Coming on to feedback conceptions, as I said, there's a large body of research that's focused on how to improve teacher feedback, and especially on the failure of students to engage with and use the feedback that teachers provide. What's interesting about this is it's been conceptualized in a variety of ways. One way is that the problem is it's being conceived as a one-way communication process rather than a two-way process. Another idea is it's being conceptualized, and I wrote this as well, it's being conceptualized as a monologue rather than a dialogue. Or it's being conceptualized as a single event rather than a cycle or a process. Now, what's important about this is the way we conceptualize the problem actually determines where we go and look for the solutions. And where everyone is looking for the solutions is in terms of trying to create dialogue, trying to create a cycle or a process, trying to improve the communication. I would like to look at this in a different way. I think that that feedback is a process that students generate all the time. I think the philosopher this morning said that. Whenever you're doing something, you're making judgments. Otherwise your behavior would be random and incomprehensible. Importantly, whenever a student receives feedback from a teacher, they have to actually make a judgment about it, otherwise it wouldn't be of any effect. So for example, just to unpack that one, the teacher delivers you some feedback. He writes something on your work. What do you have to do with it in order to make use of it? Well, first of all, you have to understand what the teacher said. You have to decode the message and understand what it is and construct some meaning from it. Then you need to evaluate that information against the assignment you've done and identify what was wrong with it and what could be improved, and what the gaps are and what alternative things could be done. And then you need to revise your understanding based on that comparative process and think about what you would change maybe in that assignment. But not only that, you would need to actually transfer that idea, that rethought idea, into subsequent assignments in order to make use of it. Now what this shows is that evaluation underpins all of the things that the students are doing. The students are evaluating and they're generating their own feedback. So the feedback that comes from someone else means nothing unless it gets turned into an inner feedback process. So why spend all our time thinking about this external stuff, and why not just think about how we can improve the inner feedback processes? And that's what I've been concentrating on. Another reason why we don't need to go down the path of teacher feedback is the way that teacher feedback operates in higher education bears no resemblance to the way that feedback operates in professional life. In professional life, people get feedback from a variety of sources and they have to make a judgment about it. In professional life, professionals produce feedback, they don't just consume it. Where in our higher education system are we developing students' capacity to make judgments and produce feedback and to develop the skills that they'll need when they leave university. Here are so what we really need to do to begin with is, the bottom line is, we need to give students practice in evaluating work and in making judgments about it. I mean, you're not going to become good at this by listening to teachers' judgments. You're going to have to start doing some of this yourself in a controlled context. Some of the things that people say are important behind this, that developing judgments is intended to help you develop your own internal concept of what quality work is. If you can't develop that concept, then you're not going to be very good when you go out into the professions. And making judgments will help you develop that, rather than acquiring information. Secondly, Roy Sadler, who is well worth reading in this area, has argued that we need to be able to learn to make holistic, configural judgments as well as analytic judgments, which raises all this issue about criteria. It's not about getting the teacher's criteria and using it. It's about developing your own internal criteria. And I think, as the philosopher said, I've forgotten his name, Fabio, he said, the criteria emerge when you make the judgment. They're not there before you have the judgment. It depends what's in front of you, what criteria actually emerge. And that's important. Then, as a professional, you need to be able to, and I think Fabio talked about this as well, you need to be able to evaluate work from many different perspectives. Sometimes a work might be better from one perspective than from another perspective. And you, as professionals, need to be able to look at things. That is a characteristic of professionals. And usefully, you need to be able to produce some convincing arguments for your judgment. So these are the things that should be going on in this. Now, I want to look at peer review, and my definition of peer review for this talk is that peer review is an arrangement whereby students produce a written assignment, then review and provide feedback, comments, and assignments produced by peers on the same topic. It has to be the same topic, we'll see in a moment. And there are two processes. There are reviewing, involving generating feedback, and there's receiving reviews and interpreting feedback. I actually, even in peer review, I'm more interested in the reviewing component of it than I am in the feedback you get from your fellow students, if I had to choose between the two, which I don't. Now, I'm talking about a written assignment at the moment, rather than peer review can happen in other ways, but I'll focus on this, and then when we get to the questions, I'll open it into other areas, if there are any questions. Okay, I was involved in two projects. I'll just say something about peer review. My projects were really focused on trying to separate out the effects of reviewing from receiving reviews, because when I looked at the literature, when I got into that area, I discovered that all of it had been confounded by a number of things. One was that there was either people focused too much on the extra feedback that students got from it, and didn't actually focus on the reviewing process. That was one thing. Or they confounded these two together. And the other thing was that a lot of the work was on peer assessment, where you ask students to mark dare voti to the other students. And I discovered in the study I'm going to talk about here is one of 6. I discovered in all of my studies that the students were hesitant about this marking, about giving marks, and it undermined the process often, that giving marks didn't seem to be the important thing, and if it turned students off, it was a bad thing. So I think if you're starting out with peer review, you don't need to move it down a mark thing, or you make the marks not count for much. Yeah. Yeah. So there you go, there's a counter-argument. The counter-argument to that, of course, is where, when you leave university, does anyone give you marks for doing things? But it's a good argument, and I think that, I'm not saying that marking shouldn't be part of it. There are ways of making marking part of it. Someone here that I talked to did quite a good study in a subject. I won't mention his name here, but what he did was he created a small amount of marks for the peer reviewing process, and he seemed to think it worked perfectly. But I'm just saying that sometimes I found, every time I asked the students in my surveys, 50% of them said, we can't mark other students' work, we don't have the experience, we don't know how to do that. So it's an area of a trap, you know, even if it's a good thing to do. But if you're the right teacher, and you have the right kind of class, and you can convince them, but then you need to work out for yourself exactly what marks actually mean, and actually convey that to the students. Because when you mark things, if you give the same teacher, I won't go down this path too far, if you give the same teacher the same things to mark at a different time, they give it different marks. You know, if you give another teacher the same thing to mark, they give it different marks. So marking is a kind of hornet's nest, we say in English. Anyway, I'll leave that for now. But anyway, I'm interested in peer review, not peer assessment, for this main reason then now, which is that reviewing something and commenting on it invokes multi-criterion judgments, whereas making a mark can be done very simply without much effort at all, I would argue. You know, it's very easy to say, I'll give this 60, I'll give this 40. It's quite difficult to write a commentary on why you think this piece of work is not good or not. But you could create marks with different levels of performance, but let me not go down that path because I have specific views on that. Okay, peer feedback receipt. There's been a lot of studies on this. I'm not going to say much about it, but basically, you know, people have found that receiving feedback from peers can be, the students find it beneficial in some way. They get more feedback, they get a variety of feedback, it may reinforce what the teacher says, and it's more, sometimes they can write things that's closer to where the students are. Receiving reviews, there have been studies on this, you know, showing that, you know, receiving reviews can be beneficial, and the last one there, Joan MacArthur, showed that students made more complex revisions to their work when they received feedback from multiple peers when compared to a single peer or a single teacher. So they, in a very tight study, they proved that receiving feedback. However, you know, the main reason why the multiple feedback had an effect was the students had to think about it and make a judgment about what had to be used. So they thought more deeply about it. However, when I started out in this area, I felt there was not enough research that had actually been looking at the reviewing component of peer review and how students constructed feedback instead of the receipt of feedback. And I wrote a paper, which I'll just briefly summarize here, for the QA in 2011, where I kind of summarized what I thought might be the benefits, and they were quite straightforward. But what was interesting was the study I'm just going to show actually showed more interesting things than I had hypothesized in my study, in my initial paper. So I wrote a set of ideas. Being a cognitive psychologist, I thought I can make an argument for this. I made the argument, but the student's argument was better than mine. So first of all, I thought, well, if you ask students to review, they're going to engage in a high-level cognitive activity, and it's certainly going to involve more mental effort than receiving reviews, so that should be better if you want student activity and interactivity. Secondly, the students would be, if they're reviewing, they're probably being given criteria, and they'd apply criteria to multiple versions of the same thing, so they would learn something about criteria and how to apply them. That seemed like a good thing. Thirdly, if they wrote reviews, if they have to write a commentary, they would kind of rehearse their own knowledge and understand things better. That seemed to be important. Fourthly, that they would see work from different perspectives and evaluate it from different ways, and that would also let them see, possibly, that quality could actually be produced in different ways. It wasn't a single version of quality. And finally, no, not finally, penultimately, that this would shift the responsibility to the student, as Valentina says. It would put them in the role of assessor, and they would be able to see things in a slightly different way, how you exercise critical judgment. And then finally, if they were doing peer review, they would be applying, they would go back and apply the thing to their own work, or they would learn skills that they could apply to their own work. So that was my kind of initial paper in 2011. Then I worked with some engineers, and I won't go into detail on the study because I want you to see particularly the quotes. These were the people involved in it. It was an engineering design class, and there were 82 students, And their task really was to design a product, you know, to go into the city, and the theme was eating and resting in the city, and they had to design a food tray or packaging for food or a seating arrangement in the town. So they kind of researched it in groups, and then they had to produce individually a product design specification, which is a complex document that they have to, it includes mathematical stuff, you know, the life cycle of the product, the rationale for the design, you know, so it's a range of different stuff. They hadn't seen one of those before, and so they were given an exemplar of a product design specification from another domain to just see what the format of it was. And the peer review task, well, it was all done in the online environment, so it was anonymous, I should say. And the peer review task was that individually, each student had to review and provide feedback anonymously on 2 other students' work online. And they were given some criteria. I haven't written out the detail of the criteria, but it was about the completeness of the design, the convincingness of the rationale, the specificity of certain values, and a suggestion for improvement. And the students could update their own work either after giving feedback or after they received feedback from the other students, or any point. And what we found was that students updated their own work, started updating it as soon as they'd done the reviews and before they received anything, which was the first sign that things were different. The peer review was not assessed directly in this, but they were given marks for participating, for professionalism in that. Now, this study, I should just say, it's one of about 6 studies, and I got the same results in all the studies, and we're doing some good work here. I'm doing some work with Anna and Valentina and other people here on peer review, so we'll see whether it all comes out the same here. We're doing some even more interesting work here, because this was just my starting study, but it provides enough background to... Now, there was an online survey, there were focus groups, and we recorded comments, and there was the students did improve in their marks. But I really want to look at the survey and the focus groups first here, because I want to look behind the process. So, which aspects of the peer review did you learn from? They seem to, more people seem to say they learned from receiving than giving, and half said that they learned from both. But when I actually asked them, did you modify your initial submission as a result of this, the results kind of evened out on that, so they made improvements. Then I asked them, what did you do? What kind of changes did you make? And they said, these are the things. They wrote lists and lists of these things, which right away told me that if they were making these changes without any input from the teacher, at the very least this was saving teachers a little bit of time. Then I asked them 2 questions. Yeah, I asked them 2 questions. This gets to the important stuff. I asked them, what did you learn from giving feedback? What did you learn from receiving feedback? I'll do it in this order. And then what did you learn from giving feedback? And I collated all their responses and categorized them. And these are the kinds of things that they said for receiving feedback. Most of the responses were in the very first category, specific content measured. Someone told me I needed to improve the depth of my analysis. I was told I need to do more, I need to create more numerical data and figures. I need to increase the strength of the rationale. I need to structure it better. So they were told things that could be made better, that should be made better. That was the major thing. That's a very small category, maybe 10, 15% talked about reader response. Receiving peer reviews from other people let me know how people read my work, which is a useful thing. So they learned something about, which is quite good. If you're writing for someone, it's useful to know how people misinterpret or read your stuff, and that seemed to be one. Some people said that people pointed out things that they hadn't noticed. About 5% said that the receiving reviews was motivating. Someone said something positive, well done or whatever, and you did quite a good thing there, and they felt good about that. And then about 5% in all my studies said they weren't very good, the reviews. I didn't really get much, out of it, because the reviews I received were not of very high quality. Now, this, to me, is a design issue that can be addressed. One way of addressing it, but I'll come back to this later, is just to increase the number of reviews that they receive, and increase the number of items they review so that they get more. Another way of dealing with that would be to match reviewers and reviewees in some kind of way. But that's not necessarily the way I would go, but that's two ways of improving that. When I asked them, what did you get, what did you give examples of what you learned from providing feedback reviews, I got a qualitatively different sets of responses. About 30% of them, and these were overlapping responses, talked about critical thinking and critical judgment. I learned how to look at work critically. I learned how to evaluate things, look at things from a critical point of view. So they were learning how to make judgments in some kind of way. Another 30% of the responses were about, understanding expectations. I learned what the teacher was looking for. I learned something about the criteria. I seemed to see, could take the teacher's perspective. However, the largest number of responses, over 90% of the students made responses in the third category, which was, when I was reviewing the other people's work, I reflected back on my own work and realized something about my own work. There were gaps in my own work. There were mistakes in it. There were things I could improve in it. There was, I'd created misunderstandings in it. So 90% of them talked about this backward reflection process. And it's this backward reflection process that I'm very interested in peer review. This fact that when the students, it's not a random fact. The fact is that the students have spent considerable time writing their own assignment. And then you say to them, could you review these other assignments, and they're written in the same domain? What's the first thing they do? The first thing they do is they compare the other assignment against their own. That's the first comparative judgment they make. Is this one better than mine? That's what they think. They don't look for the criteria. They don't say, where's the teacher's criteria? I find the criteria and I'll know if this one's better than mine. They just say, this one is better than mine because they see something in it that the teacher hasn't told them about, and then they look at another one and they see the other one and they do the same thing again. And then they look at the two together, and as we'll see in a moment, and they compare them with each other and with their own. So I then asked them in more detail, how do you, could you make any comments about how you carried out the peer review? What mental processes did you go through? And 70% of them, I think, used a word that was either compare or a word that involved compare, like I tried to think about what I wrote and whether the PDS was better or worse than mine. So it involves comparison. All evaluation involves comparison. But if I've done some work and then I see some other work, what am I going to compare it with? The other work. Then this is a comment. Can you read that with the light, yeah? Will I read it out? Okay, I'll read out what the student said. This is very important, though. Okay, ask the students, how do you go about reviewing? And the students said, I read it through and compared it with what I had done to see if they had put something I had not done, and then I added it in if they hadn't. The 4 questions, which were the criteria they were using, provided by the teacher, were useful as they provided a framework for the review. If we hadn't had the questions, it would have been difficult. I did the reviews separately and then answered one, then the other. So they're answering the questions or the criteria. The first was a better standard than the other, so I used the ideas from the better one to comment on the weaker one. Not only are they using the ideas to think about their own, but they're using the ideas from the better one to comment on the weaker one, and their own ideas to comment on it. I also read the guidelines in class when I did the peer review. There were ideas from the good one that I hadn't even thought of in mine. So this comparative process. So they're comparing it with what has been done before. They are using the criteria, and I'll come back to this, the questions, to make the response, and they're comparing one against the other. When I asked them, because I've probed a bit further on the criteria, I wanted to know a bit more about how the criteria were kind of interacting in this process. And what I got from the students was that even when they were using the criteria, they were comparing against their own. So they're making, and we'll see in a moment, this involves different kinds of judgment. So you compare it, the student's own work, to the criteria, then in the back of your mind you're comparing it to your own at the same time. I went down the questions and compared it to my own. I was trying to think what this person had done, have they put in more effort or knowledge than me? I went through the questions, the criteria, keeping my own in mind. You've got what you've done at the back of your mind while you're going over things so you see it. So what's going on, whatever they're doing in this scenario, their focus is on what they've done. It's coming back to them. So anything they look at, so while making judgments about other stuff, they're making judgments about their own. So to summarize that section, one benefit of reviewing is that it elicits multiple acts of reflection and evaluative judgment. Students are evaluating the peer's work against their own, they're evaluating one peer's work against another and against their own, and they're evaluating the work against the given criteria to produce a response while still considering their own. And the reason why this works is because the students have produced a piece of work themselves before they do the peer review. This makes peer review different from asking students to evaluate a research paper or something else because they haven't written a research paper. It's the fact that they've spent the effort investing in this themselves that makes the difference. And what I've discovered is that a lot of the best practices in assessment and feedback utilize this principle, although people haven't talked about it. When Fabio talks tomorrow about clickers, he talks about a scenario where he gets students, he's used the traditional scenario where you give students a question and they respond with the clickers, and then you see the response, and then you normally just ask the students to have a discussion about who got the, you convince your neighbour that you have the right answer. Now, what they've done is they've made a commitment to an answer themselves before they go into the discussion. But that's a low level, and a way to improve the clicker technology is what Fabio did, whereas he asked the students not only to make a judgment, but to give a confidence rating for their judgment. And by asking for the confidence rating, they've invested more of their own thinking into the process. Hence, the result of the discussion should be better. Okay, I'm not sure how I'm on for time. The second benefit of reviewing is this story about criteria, which I seem to always be pushed into a corner with here, but I have now a chance to finally explain my position on this. When students are reviewing, they both create and apply criteria. First of all, when they compare work against their own, they're using their own criteria. They're making a holistic judgment about the work, and they're generating their own criteria. This is better than my one because. This one is better than the other one because. When they're applying criteria, when they're writing the response, they're engaging in an analytic judgment. They're making a response against specific criteria. In the first one, it's a holistic judgment. It involves inductive reasoning. The second one, it's an analytic judgment. It involves deductive reasoning. And why this is so important is that this process simulates what experts do when they make evaluative judgments. When experts make evaluative judgments, they do not sit down and use criteria. The criteria, when someone sends me a paper to review, I look at it and I think, is this good or bad? What would I think about it? And then I make a response against the criteria. When the teachers mark your student work, unless it's in mathematics, if it's in an open-ended subjective area, that is what they do. If they tell you they mark specifically with criteria, they might be telling you an untruth, because we tend to use both simultaneously, holistic and analytic simultaneously. We make configural and analytic judgments, and that's what professionals do. And this is how we develop an inner concept of quality. I argued that reviewing, in the paper I wrote on this, students generate richer criteria than those provided by the teacher, but sounder criteria than those that they might be able to formulate on their own. But you can see, if you think about the philosophical talk this morning about emergent criteria, that criteria emerge depending on what you're looking at and what you're looking for and what confronts you. Sometimes if you use the criteria, the work that was produced could meet all of the criteria but be a bad piece of work. Or it could meet all the criteria but be a fantastic piece of work that's better than the criteria. How do we take account of those things? Okay, so then we asked the students, what do you think is best for learning, giving or receiving feedback? And I'll have to read this again. This student says, for me it would probably be to give feedback, because I think seeing what other people have done is more helpful than getting other people's comments on what you have already done. By looking at other people's work, you can see for yourself what you have forgotten or not even thought about. When people give feedback on yours, they generally just talk about what's there. They don't say, well, I did this on mine and you could put that in yours. What this student is identified as a fundamental weakness in teacher feedback. The teacher can't show you all the different ways that something could be done. It's impossible for them to do that because they don't have the time. So they mark your work based on what you've produced and they comment on it on that level. What the student is saying is, by seeing other things, it takes me outside my zone and I see things that I might never have seen before. So it puts things into a different perspective. Another comment, what did you think was best for learning, giving or receiving feedback? This student says, I think when you're reviewing the peers' work, the work of peers, it's more a self-learning process. You're teaching yourself. This is an argument against the transmission view. Well, I can see somebody's done this, that, and that's a strength. And I should maybe try and incorporate that somehow into my work. Whereas getting the teacher feedback, you're kind of being told what to do. You're getting told, this is the way you should be doing it, and this is the right way to do it. You're not really thinking for yourself. I think reviewing would help you not need so much teacher feedback. If there were more of this, whereas I think if you're not being able to do reviewing, then you will always be needing more teacher feedback. What do the students think about this? Is there a student who's going to comment here? Yeah. And the thing is that the students are seeing examples of other students' work in this particular case. So they're seeing, things that they can compare against. And of course, when you look at something else, some things might be worse than yours and other things might be better. So you learn different things. It depends what you focus on. So why I like peer review, it fits into my whole notion of generative feedback, that students construct feedback meanings for themselves while they produce explicit feedback for peers. And if we focused more on this feedback construction by students, I think we'd make more progress. It puts feedback processes back into the hands of the student because the students generate it all themselves and we can just go away and design and sleep. Students scrutinize many examples of the same work of different quality, so they learn about different ways of producing quality. Through writing their feedback explanations, they build new knowledge, they construct a more elaborate understanding. It reduces the perceived need for teacher feedback, and it suggests another focus for teacher feedback, helping students to calibrate the quality of their own judgments. So the question now becomes on this, the interesting question is, if the students are going to generate all their feedback themselves, what the hell is the teacher going to be doing? Sorry. What is the role of the teacher in this now? Because the teacher's role can't be necessarily to write feedback on the feedback that the students have given, because then you're falling back into the trap of the teacher writing the feedback. So what's the solution to that conundrum? What is the solution? You want to know it. You don't know the solution. Well, one of the audience must know the solution. What's the solution? No. Well, I think there's two elements to it. Theoretical. I'll do this first. Well, it relates to this. well, no, it relates to the second one. Okay, I'll go back one. Okay, the solution to that one is two things, I think. I don't want to be too extreme on this. The first one is that well, it does actually, let me just say this one first, because, you know, the real problem with peer review, as I see it now, when my students had 2 reviews to do, is that there's not enough examples. You know, to develop an internal concept of quality requires variation. You need to see a range of examples from good to bad. And ideally, you need to see more than one good example, because you want the students to understand that good quality can be produced in different ways. If they only see one example, they'll think that that's a good example and I must do that. So the variation must be carefully controlled. That's the first thing. And the way to do that is to use, one way to do it is to use past students' work and choose the examples carefully so they're all reviewing a particular sets of work done by students in the past in the same assignment domain. And that should bring me to the teacher one, which is the bottom one, that the way to deal with this is to put an example of the teacher's work in the works to be reviewed. And then ask the students, for example, to rank order the work from best to worst, or to comment on it in some way, and to find out whether the students actually understand what good quality work actually is by seeing it. Now, if they don't, I think my other partial solution to that is that you need to, and I think this is true for any of these processes, you need to wrap dialogue around it. All of the peer review processes can be improved through dialogue. So, for example, the students could do their assignment in pairs or in groups. They could review in pairs or in groups. You know, they could respond to the reviews in pairs or in groups. So you can add dialogue around it to get a better result. The second problem, I think, is kind of an interesting one, and I only put this on the slide recently, is that peer review normally focuses on what has been done rather than on how the work was actually produced. And in mathematics and in other subjects, you know, what's important is not that you get the right answer, it's how you got to the answer that's the important thing. So how do you do peer review in that scenario? How you do peer review in that scenario is you make recordings of students talking aloud as they're trying to solve problems, and you create the right variation. People who can solve the problem, talking it through, and people who are not very good at it, and poor students, and then you get the students to try and solve the problem, and then you send them to review the process videos of other people solving the problem. Or first of all, you get the students to solve the problem and make a short video of themselves talking through how they're solving it. Even the very act of asking students to do that will improve their learning, because it taps into a whole body of literature rarely talked about, which is called the self-explanation effect. If you try and explain things to yourself, you actually learn quite a lot from it, because you notice there are gaps in your understanding. But you could create a set of videos in any subject like music, engineering, mathematics. It would be a one-off resource that you created that could be used year in, year out, where students actually learn how the process was done by listening to other people. There's quite a lot of research on this in cognitive psychology that has never really been tapped into in education. The usual concerns that people raise with me are the ones about the students. The students don't like sharing their ideas, they don't receive good feedback, or they don't like commenting on their fellow students. And all of these can be dealt with in different ways. You know, one is that, you know, it's important in any new practice to explain to students why you're doing this and why it's important, and that actually reviewing things, even if you see or reviewing poor things, will help you to learn. But you could just do number 3, which is implement peer review without any receipt of reviews, and that would have an interesting benefit on its own. I think I'll just finish on this. I won't talk through these because I want to see if there's any more questions, but I've created a paper on this where I go through the principles of good peer review. And the only tool I'll mention here, because I've talked a lot about the others, is the one about dialogue. That dialogue should be wrapped around the process, and that will make it much better. And the idea of integrating self-review into peer review scenarios. So after students have done peer review, although they're reflecting back, you could actually ask them to reflect back on their own work in different ways. So I think I'm at, oh, yeah. Okay. Does this thing get a video on it?
So the two-stage exam is a very simple process. You do an exam just like normal, an individual exam. Students hand that exam in, and then you immediately get them into groups of 4, and you have them do the exact same exam again.
Once you have your group of 4, stay seated and raise your hands. One of our TAs or instructors will give you a group exam, and then you may start.
You only give them one piece of paper though, they have to agree on the answers. So they basically teach each other what they got wrong. It's very interesting and exciting to see students arguing about your topic with enthusiasm, and there's high fives and swearing, and it's very interesting. They're very happy when they get it right, and they're upset when they get it wrong, but it's good for them to know right away.
I think for me, the wonderful thing about two-stage exams is it's almost like a second chance. There's a first portion where we get to test what we've learned and how we've studied, and a second portion where we get to go over some of our answers with classmates, so we get different sides of learning. I definitely feel like I learn more and I remember more.
We've done research that shows that student retention is better when they do the exams in this format. So they correct themselves immediately what they got wrong, and then they retain that information better. I don't ever want to do an exam another way because it's so exciting and interesting to see students really engaging with your material. A colleague of mine in life sciences had a TA that burst into tears when she saw a two-stage exam because they're talking about biology. So it's very exciting to see as an instructor.
Two-stage exams is a situation where you get the students to class and you give them a test of some kind, a complex thing to do individually. You collect it in, and then you ask them to do exactly the same thing again in a group of 4. And the students engage in very strong interactive discussion, and generally it maximizes the feedback, the receipt, both the receipt and the giving of feedback in that scenario. And it's become a very popular technique. But someone asked this morning about, tell me a thing that you could do in a large class that would create maximal feedback. This is a perfect thing for that, and I would ask you to reflect on the bottom thing. Imagine the teacher had to comment on each individual student's work as opposed to putting them in a group. They'll get more feedback in the group than they will ever from a single teacher commenting, and it takes away the teacher's work completely. So this is one example, moving away from my example, of where peer review is creating an internal effect in the students and an improvement in their thinking and discussion and evaluation that far surpasses anything that a single teacher could actually provide.